You're
talking a eukaryotic.
Yeah, when you talk about the origin of eukaryotic cells,
right.
It's a phenomenon called symbiogenesis, where you're looking at the merger of bacterial cells into a conglomerate
right.
that then become so intertwined and interdependent because of that symbiotic relationship that they actually take on the character of a completely distinct organism. So that's strictly non-Darwinian as a mechanism, and I'm not sure that the types of mechanisms that evolutionary biologists have identified that manipulate the genetic code can essentially adequately account for what has to happen when those kinds of phenomena are taking place.
So why wouldn't that be Darwinian?
Well, because Darwinian evolution involves modifying genetic material information and then having some form of selection or genetic drift operating on that to create new information and hence new organisms. This is essentially the wholesale fusion of organisms, and out of that wholesale fusion, now you're creating basically a completely different genetic apparatus. And in fact, Lynn Margulis, who championed in modern times the endosymbiont hypothesis, argued that it was viruses being incorporated into genomes
right.
as a form of symbiogenesis that actually produced speciation. That speciation wasn't driven through this idea of selection operating on heritable variation, but it was the infusion of big chunks of information coming from another organism, in this case a virus, that then would alter the biological capacities through that fusion event.
So does that answer a God in the gaps kind of thing, or do you see actually a divine hand in that?
Well, to me, in a sense, those kind of mechanisms are what undergird increasingly genetic engineering. So now you're looking at, for example, scientists taking metabolic pathways that are encoded in the genome from one microorganism and incorporating them into the genome of another microorganism. So now you've got, yeast that will produce compounds that a particular plant will produce, where those compounds have, let's say, anti-malarial or anti-cancer benefits. So now you've engineered a yeast to not only behave like a yeast, but to have genetic information that would be found in some kind of yew plant or something like that, right? And so that's an example of genetic engineering that is following after this notion of symbiogenesis. But when you look at what has to happen to get that to work, you've got to have biochemists that understand, number one, in detail the metabolic pathways in yeast, and then how they can tweak those pathways so that you can then integrate this completely different metabolic system into it, and then how do you further tweak it so that you then funnel the metabolites down the pathway to produce the compound of interest. So you're going in and you're reworking the regulatory processes in the cell.
So you actually see a divine hand.
Well, you see the human intelligence that would be a metaphor or
No, it's intelligent.
Right. It would be, it's intelligently
So it has
designed.
to be from outside the system
right.
to jumpstart that process.
Right. And so when you look at people who are complaining about as evolutionary biologists, the endosymbiont hypothesis, it's like, okay, how do you then get metabolic processes in the endosymbiont and the host cell integrated? Because if you're taking in an endosymbiont into a host cell and that environment is conducive for that endosymbiont to live, it's just going to replicate out of control and basically destroy the host cell. So how then does the host cell sublimate the behavior of that endosymbiont? And then how do you get the endosymbiont to do things that would be sacrificial, like instead of producing ATP for its survival, to evolve a nucleotide transporter, then to export that ATP into the cytoplasm of the host cell. So I mean, you don't have this idea of endosymbiosis is a wonderful idea till you start to press into the details. But this is where you're now looking at not having mechanism that can account for that kind of integration, right? But so that would be an example where can those mechanisms actually explain, there's something else going on there. or when you talk about the origin of body plans, now you're talking about cells going from kind of loose colonial associations with other cells to cells actually essentially having to integrate their activity with the activity of other cells, where some of those cells are going to have to actually sacrifice themselves to create the body plan, or cells are going to become specialized, and in doing so are not going to be able to survive apart from being interdependent with other cells. And then you've got to have these communication mechanisms and regulation mechanisms functioning in the global organism, right? And then you've got to have internal pathways that are communicating what's happening in the external environment to regulating activities in the cell, but that regulation is not benefiting that cell, but it's benefiting the whole organism, right? Yeah. So how does all this, come about? So it's a major transition to go from a colonial aggregate to actually an organism with even a simple body plan, let alone one that has fully integrated organ systems. Yeah. Right.
So it's anti-Darwinian in the sense of survival of the species, in the sense that it itself is giving itself away.
Yeah, you're looking at the emergence of cooperativity and self-sacrifice. So it's a non-Darwinian idea, right?
Right. Anti-Darwinian.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, that's
Could I post this someday?
Sure.
With your permission?
Yeah. You can post it. Consider this my permission.
All right.
Thanks
Thank
again.
you.
Yeah.
I appreciate you being here.
Yeah.
Nice to meet
Thanks a
you.
lot. Nice time.